The year was 1957, and little Richard was standing on a stage in Australia mid-concert when he looked up at the night sky and saw what he later described as a ball of fire arcing across the darkness overhead. He walked off the stage that same night and told the band he was done. Not done with the tour, done with rock and roll. He threw his jewelry off the Sydney Harbour Bridge, rings that had cost more than most people in the audience earned in a year, and within weeks he had enrolled in a Bible college in Huntsville, Alabama. The greatest rock performer alive in 1957, the man who had invented a sound that would not stop echoing for the rest of the century, simply walked away. He was 24 years old and selling out arenas on 2 continents. He quit anyway. What fans read at the time was that Little Richard had got religion. That was the short version. The one newspapers printed and radio hosts repeated, the one that made the whole thing sound like a colorful footnote to an otherwise straightforward career. The full version is considerably stranger, considerably more personal, and considerably harder to reduce to a single explanation, because there was never just one. Richard Wayne Penniman was born on December 5, 1932, in Macon, Georgia, the third of 12 children. His father, Charles Penniman, sold moonshine out of a club called the Tip Inn, and the house Richard grew up in was crowded, noisy, and frequently chaotic. Macon in the 1930s was a deeply segregated city, and the Penniman family was poor even by the standards of the neighborhood they lived in. What distinguished Richard early was not musical talent alone, though that was obvious from childhood, but a theatrical intensity that made adults uncomfortable. He was what people in Macon called sissy from the time he was very young. He walked differently. He talked differently. He painted his face with his mother's makeup and pomade. His father, by multiple accounts, was ashamed of him, and the tension between them was not occasional but constant. Charles Penniman once told someone that he had fathered 3 sons and 2 daughters, pointedly excluding Richard from both categories. At 13, Richard was effectively turned out of the family home after his father remarried. He went to live with a white family in Macon, Ann and Johnny Johnson, who owned a club called the Tick-Tock Club, and began performing there in the evenings. He billed himself as Little Richard from around this time, a name that started as a joke and stuck. In 1950, he won a talent contest in Atlanta that got him a recording contract with RCA Victor. The records from that period went nowhere. He moved to Peacock Records. Those went nowhere either. He spent the early 1950s working as a dishwasher at the Macon Greyhound bus station while still performing on weekends and sending demo tapes to every label he could reach. The demo that changed everything landed at Specialty Records in New Orleans in 1955. Robert Bumps Blackwell, an A&R man at Specialty, listened to a rough tape and heard something the earlier recordings had never captured. An energy that was not just performative, but physically overwhelming. A voice that didn't sing melodies so much as attack them. Blackwell flew Richard to New Orleans for a session in September 1955. The first day of recording was polite and professional and produced nothing anyone was excited about. Then, during a lunch break, Richard sat down at the studio piano and started playing a song he'd been performing in clubs for years, a song so sexually explicit that he'd never seriously considered putting it on record. Blackwell heard it and immediately understood that the lyrical content would have to be revised before anyone could sell it. He rewrote the verses on the spot. What remained was the piano part, the rhythm, and that voice doing something to the syllables that no one had done before on a commercial record. Tutti Frutti was released in November 1955. Within weeks, it was in the top 10 on the R&B charts. Within months, it had crossed over to the pop charts, an achievement that was not automatic for black artists in 1955. It crossed over because it was impossible to contain. The record physically demanded a response from whoever heard it, and it didn't care who that person was or what radio station they were listening to. Over the next 2 years, Little Richard released Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, Slippin' and Slidin', Jenny Jenny, Keep a Knockin', Good Golly, Miss Molly, and Lucille. Every one of them charted. Several were covered almost immediately by white artists. Pat Boone had a hit with Long Tall Sally that outsold Richard's original on the pop charts, a situation that was standard practice in the music industry at the time and that Richard understood clearly even while smiling through public appearances. He once said, in a 1970 interview, that Pat Boone's version of Long Tall Sally made him more money than his own did, because the publishing was structured that way. He said it without particular bitterness, but he said it. The performances were where Richard could not be replaced or reproduced. He played piano standing up. He screamed on pitch. He wore his hair in a pompadour, 6 inches tall, and wore makeup on stage at a time when no male performer, black or white, was doing anything of the kind in mainstream venues. He had a vocal warm-up sound, a nonsense syllable sequence that he used to open his lungs before launching into a song, and audiences started screaming when they heard it before he had sung a word. The woo and the a-wop-bop-a-loo-bop that opened Tutti Frutti are not lyrics so much as physiological events. They happen to you before you decide to let them. By 1957, he was one of the most commercially successful and artistically influential musicians in America. He was also, by his own account, genuinely frightened. The fear had several sources, and they were not all religious. One was guilt about money. Richard had grown up without it and was now making quantities of it that felt unreal and dangerous. He was sending money home to family regularly while spending lavishly on himself, on clothes and jewelry and hotels. The spending didn't relieve the guilt, it compounded it. The more he spent, the more he felt he was performing a version of himself that wasn't real. A second source was fear of discovery. Richard had been sexually involved with men since he was a teenager, and this was not incidental to his stage persona. The makeup, the screaming femininity that coexisted with an aggressive physical confidence. The way he embodied something that didn't fit any existing category. But in 1957 in America, what he was doing on stage was legal, and what he was doing privately was not. He had been arrested once already in a gas station bathroom in Macon in 1955, and the charge was dismissed. But he knew what the charge had been and what it would mean if it became public. The fame that was protecting him financially was also making him more visible, more vulnerable. The third source was specifically religious, and it ran deeper than the others. Richard had been raised in the church, Seventh-day Adventist on his mother's side, and he had also spent time with Pentecostal congregations in Macon that were loud and physical, full of testimony and glossolalia, and an understanding of spiritual experience as something that happened in your body, not just in your mind. That framework had never left him. When he was performing at his most extreme, the thing happening in the room was not entirely different from what happened in those churches. He knew that. The audience was responding to the same set of stimuli. He found that exhilarating and also increasingly troubling. Not because he thought rock and roll was evil in any abstract sense, but because he was not sure anymore which altar he was serving. In the summer of 1957, two things happened in close sequence. A close friend of Richard's died in a car crash, and Richard, who had been raised to read events as signs, began reading events. He started attending church services again while on tour. He talked to preachers backstage. He carried a Bible. The people around him thought it was a phase. Performers went through phases, found Jesus or found something, and then came back. It had happened before with other people. It would pass. In October 1957, Richard was in Australia on tour. On the night of October 12th, during a performance in Sydney, he looked up during the show and saw lights in the sky. There was a plausible earthly explanation. Sputnik had been launched 11 days earlier, on October 4th, and a rocket connected to its launch was visible in the Southern Hemisphere sky that month. Richard almost certainly saw a burning rocket stage. But Richard did not experience what he saw as a burning rocket stage. He experienced it as a sign addressed specifically to him. He walked off the stage. He told the promoters the tour was over. He threw his jewelry into Sydney Harbour, rings, bracelets, several pieces he'd bought specifically for the Australian tour, and flew back to the United States. Within weeks, he had enrolled at Oakwood College, a historically black Seventh-day Adventist school in Huntsville, Alabama, where he began studying theology. Specialty Records was not pleased. He had several albums worth of contractual obligations and no intention of fulfilling them. Art Rupi, who ran Specialty, had developed and invested in Richard for 3 years, and now watched him walk away from one of the most lucrative acts on the label's roster. Richard told Rupi, in terms that were not ambiguous, that God had spoken and that Specialty Records would have to work around God's schedule. The relationship became litigious and remained unresolved for years. At Oakwood, Richard sang in the choir, studied scripture, and recorded gospel music. He was not in hiding. He gave interviews. He talked publicly about his conversion. He described the Sydney night sky in vivid detail. But he was also not entirely at peace. He was still recognizably himself, theatrical, loud, funny, aware of the camera, even when the camera was not on him. What he was, during those years away from commercial rock and roll, was genuinely searching. And the search was for something more specific than salvation in a generic sense. He wanted to understand how to be the person he was in a framework that could hold him. The Pentecostal and Adventist traditions he moved between during the late 1950s and early 1960s were not traditions that had space for someone who wore makeup and felt attraction to men and had spent 3 years as one of the most sexually provocative performers in American popular music. Richard knew that. He tried during this period to reconcile himself to a version of himself that those traditions could accept. He married a woman named Ernestine Harvin in 1959. They had one adopted son. The marriage lasted 12 years on paper and much less than that in practice. He released gospel records that were not commercially successful and were not intended to be commercially successful in the way his Specialty Records had been. He toured gospel circuits in the American South, performing in churches to audiences who knew exactly who he was and what he had walked away from, and some of whom were impressed by that and some of whom were skeptical. Gospel performers who had never had a pop career looked at Little Richard performing gospel music with a degree of complicated feeling. He was not entirely at home in that world either. By 1962, he was back on the road, but not yet fully back in rock and roll. He toured Europe, where he encountered the Beatles, still unknown in America, performing as his opening act in Hamburg and Liverpool. Paul McCartney and John Lennon had learned to sing by trying to replicate what he did. McCartney's falsetto on I'm Down is a direct attempt to reproduce a physical effect that Richard had on audiences, and McCartney has said so explicitly in multiple interviews over the decades. When Richard met the Beatles, he recognized people who had studied him the way he had studied the preachers he grew up hearing, and he found that gratifying and strange in equal measure. He released an album on VJ in 1962. He signed with Mercury in 1963. Neither produced anything like the commercial impact of the Specialty years. The records weren't bad, but something about the timing was off. The music industry was reorganizing itself around a British invasion that had learned everything it knew from the people the American industry had stopped properly promoting. Richard watched the Beatles become the biggest act in the world, partly on the strength of sounds he had helped invent. He came back to rock and roll officially in 1964, and then again more substantially in 1966, and then with a significant effort in 1970 on Reprise Records. The 1970 albums found an audience that was partially new rock fans who knew him as an influence rather than a contemporary, and they were energetic and often excellent. But they didn't restore him to the commercial position he had occupied in 1957, and nothing was going to. The window for that had closed. The industry had reorganized itself, and the reorganization hadn't left a space for a 38-year-old black performer who'd spent years doing gospel music. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Richard worked steadily. He appeared on television programs, gave interviews, showed up in films in small roles, and performed at revival concerts. He was a recognizable figure on the nostalgia circuit without being reducible to nostalgia. Every time someone put him on a stage, he performed with an urgency that suggested someone still working something out, not someone coasting on a reputation. He continued to move between religious commitment and the life of a touring performer without ever fully resolving the tension between them. He spoke about God in nearly every interview he gave throughout those decades. He also, by his own later account, spent significant portions of them using cocaine. He checked into drug rehabilitation in 1985. After that, he spoke about sobriety and faith in the same breath, with a specificity that came from having been somewhere darker. In 1986, he was inducted into the first class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He accepted the award and gave a speech that was classic Richard: funny, theologically strange, personally revealing without being confessional. He had a gift for making discomfort feel like joy, which is probably related to the original gift that made Tutti Frutti sound the way it did. There is a 1985 interview with Robert Palmer in Rolling Stone, in which Richard talks about the 1957 decision at some length. He describes the moment in Australia with real conviction. He is not performing the conversion story, he is telling it, which is a different thing and visible to anyone paying attention. He describes the jewelry going into the harbor. He describes the feeling of lightness afterward, the sense that something enormous had been put down. He also, in the same interview, describes the things the decision cost him. He names specific records he didn't make. He mentions the Beatles and notes, without self-pity, that they took what he had built and constructed something the record industry rewarded in ways it had never rewarded him. He doesn't frame this as theft, but he names the fact plainly, which is what he always did with facts that were uncomfortable. What that interview captures, and what most accounts of Richard's 1957 departure miss, is that the decision was not irrational and was not simply religious. It was a decision made by someone who was exhausted, frightened, guilty, and spiritually serious all at the same time, in a body that was doing things on stage that the world outside the stage wanted to punish him for. The conversion gave him a frame for leaving that made sense to him and that he could tell publicly. But the reasons for leaving were not reducible to the frame. The reasons were specific. He was gay in 1957 America and performing in a way that made that visible. And visibility was danger. He was making money that felt unreal and spending it in ways that felt wrong. He was in a business that was taking his music and paying other people for it. He was performing at a level of physical and emotional intensity that was not sustainable. And he had grown up believing that the world sent signs, and the world had sent him one, and he had decided to take it seriously. All of those things were true at once. He left because all of them were true at once. He spent the rest of his life moving between the sacred and the secular in a way that stopped looking like inconsistency once you understood that he did not experience them as opposites. He would give an interview describing his faith in language that was completely sincere, and then he would get on stage and do something with a microphone that had nothing to do with church. And both of those things were real. He had always been the kind of person who contained contradictions without resolving them, which is not a character flaw and is not hypocrisy. It is the actual condition of most human beings. And Richard was honest enough to say so out loud. He gave his last public performances in the early 2010s, past the point where his health made touring easy. He had hip surgery in 2005 and recovered and performed again and kept going. He was diagnosed with bone cancer and died on May 9th, 2020 in Nashville. He was 87 years old. The tributes that came in the days after his death were specific in the way that only real grief produces. Not everyone agreeing on the same thing, but every person who said something naming a particular record, a particular moment, a particular night when something shifted because of him. That is the more honest measure of what he did. In the end, the thing he quit in 1957 had not really disappeared. He had taken it with him. The music he made after 1957 was not the same as the music he made before, but it was made by the same person. And that person had never fully stopped believing that what happened between a performer and an audience was not merely entertainment, that it was something older than entertainment, something the church had a name for and the nightclub had a name for too, and that those names might, in certain rooms, under certain conditions, turn out to be the same word.